The gates of Hollow Ridge shook as another wave of enemy wolves slammed against the wooden barricade, and Elena Marsh pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the food cellar, counting sacks of grain in the dark. There were not enough. There had never been enough, not for 300 wolves trapped behind broken walls, and she knew that before the sun rose again, someone would have to tell Damon Hale the truth he refused to hear. Above her, the sounds of battle rattled through the floorboards. Growls. Shouted orders. The heavy thud of bodies hitting the packed earth of the courtyard. Elena had lived through sieges before. She had lived through more than most creatures ever would, and the weight of that long life sat on her shoulders like a second skin, invisible to everyone but her. She climbed the narrow stairs from the cellar with a lantern in one hand and a ledger in the other, her boots silent on the stone. When she pushed open the door at the top, the smell of smoke and blood hit her immediately, sharp and metallic, carried on cold night air. Warriors moved across the courtyard in blurs of gray and brown fur, snapping at shadows that came over the wall in waves. Damon stood at the center of it all, no longer wearing the calm authority of a king, but the raw fury of an alpha defending his home. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his eyes glowing amber in the dark, and when he turned and saw her standing in the doorway, something in his expression cracked open for just a moment, before he shut it away again. "Get back inside," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the noise around them. "The grain will not last 3 more days, Elena said, holding up the ledger as if it were a weapon of its own. "The wells are low. If this siege continues past the week, we will not need the enemy to defeat us. We will do it ourselves, one empty stomach at a time." Damon's jaw tightened. He had heard this before, from other advisors, from his beta, from the elders who whispered in corners about surrender. But when Elena said it, it landed differently, because Elena did not deal in fear. She dealt in facts, cold and precise, the same way she always had for the past 261 years. "I cannot open the gates to trade," he said. "You know what waits beyond them." "I am not asking you to open the gates," Elena said, stepping closer, lowering her voice so the words would not travel to the ears of frightened warriors nearby. "I am asking you to trust me, the way you did the first night we met, when there was nothing between us and starvation, but a decision neither of us had the right to make alone." For a moment, the noise of the siege seemed to fade around them, and Damon looked at her the way he rarely allowed himself to anymore, seeing not the healer who counted his grain sacks and rationed his people's meals, but the woman who had once saved an entire pack from ruin, with nothing but her wits, and her refusal to let anyone starve on her watch. "What are you planning?" he asked, and it was not really a question, it was permission. Elena told him about the old tunnels beneath the eastern ridge, the ones dug by human traders centuries before the wolves had claimed this land, the ones she remembered from a life so long ago that most in the pack assumed they were only legend. She had walked those tunnels once, decades earlier, when a smaller crisis had threatened the pack, and she believed, with the same quiet certainty that had guided every decision she made, that they could be walked again. Damon studied her face in the lantern light, searching for hesitation and finding none. That was the thing about Elena that had bound him to her in the first place, long before either of them understood what the bond between a human healer and a wolf alpha would come to mean. She did not flinch from impossible tasks. She simply began them. "If you are caught out there," he said, "I cannot protect you. Not with the enemy at every wall." "I know," Elena said simply, and there was no fear in her voice, only the steady resolve of someone who had made peace with risk a long time ago. "But if I do nothing, we lose anyway. Slowly, painfully. I would rather try and fail than watch children go hungry while we wait for a miracle that is not coming." Behind them, a warrior collapsed near the wall, dragged back by 2 others, blood soaking through torn fur along his side. Elena's eyes flicked toward him instinctively, the healer in her rising before the strategist could stop it, but Damon caught her arm gently. "He will be tended to. Others are trained for this. You are the only one who remembers those tunnels." It was true, and they both knew it, though the reminder settled uncomfortably between them, the way most reminders of Elena's long memory did. 261 years gave a person knowledge no one else in Hollow Ridge could claim, but it also meant carrying burdens no one else could understand, watching generations of wolves live and die around her while she remained. tethered to a bond that had never fully explained itself even to the two people living inside it. Elena nodded once, tucking the ledger under her arm, and turned toward the eastern wall, where the old cellar entrance to the tunnels waited, hidden beneath a collapsed section of stone that most in the pack believed had simply crumbled with age. She had never told anyone what really lay beneath it. Some secrets were safer kept close, even from the people she trusted most. "Take Owen with you," Damon said, and this time it was not a suggestion. "I will not have you walking into the dark alone while enemies circle every inch of ground above you." Elena did not argue. She found Owen near the eastern wall, a lean gray-haired wolf who had served as Damon's beta for nearly 40 years, his loyalty as steady as stone. When she explained the plan, he did not question her the way a younger wolf might have. He simply nodded and fell into step beside her, trusting the healer's judgment the same way the rest of the pack had learned to over the decades. The entrance to the tunnels was cold and narrow, forcing them both to crouch as they descended into darkness lit only by Elena's lantern. The air smelled of damp earth and something older, something that had not been disturbed in a long time. Roots hung from the ceiling like pale fingers, and the walls, carved by human hands centuries before any wolf pack had claimed this land, still bore faint markings that Elena recognized from a life so distant, it sometimes felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. "How do you know these tunnels are still safe?" Owen asked quietly, his voice echoing slightly against the stone. "I don't," Elena admitted, "but I know they exist, and right now, that is more than we had an hour ago." They walked for what felt like miles, though Elena knew from memory that the distance was shorter than it seemed in the dark. Every few hundred feet, she paused to check markings on the walls, faint symbols that told her which direction led toward the old trading post beyond the ridge, and which led into collapsed dead ends that would trap them both if she guessed wrong. Owen said little as they moved, but Elena could feel the questions building behind his silence, the same questions she had watched form in the eyes of pack members for generations. How old are you, really? What were you before the bond? Why did an alpha choose to tie his fate to a human woman when so many wolves would have gladly claimed that place beside him? She had stopped answering those questions a long time ago, not because the answers were secret, but because they were long and complicated, and belonged to a history that most wolves in Hollow Ridge could not fully understand. The bond between her and Damon had not been born from romance or fate in the way the old stories described. It had been born from survival, from a desperate night 261 years ago, when a dying human village and an untested young alpha had needed each other more than either was willing to admit. The tunnel opened, finally, into a small chamber where the trading post's old storage room had once stood, now abandoned and half-collapsed, but still holding crates of preserved food left behind by traders who had vanished from this land generations ago. Elena felt her breath catch as her lantern light swept across the room, revealing sealed barrels and wooden crates stacked against the far wall, untouched by time, in the sealed, dry air of the underground chamber. "This is it," she whispered, more to herself than to Owen. "This is what I remembered." Owen moved forward cautiously, running a hand along one of the crates before prying it open. Inside, dried grains, preserved fruits, and salted meat sat packed in careful layers, enough to feed the pack for weeks, if rationed correctly. His eyes widened as he looked back at Elena, disbelief and gratitude mixing across his face. "How did you know this would still be here?" "Because I helped store it," Elena said quietly, and for the first time that night, something in her voice cracked just slightly, revealing the weight of memory beneath her steady composure. A long time ago, before any of this pack existed. Before Damon was even born. Owen did not press further, sensing the boundary in her words, and together, they began the slow work of carrying what supplies they could through the narrow tunnel back toward Hollow Ridge, knowing they would need to return multiple times before the pack's hunger was truly answered. Each trip meant risk, meant walking beneath enemy lines with nothing but stone and packed earth, separating them from wolves, who wanted nothing more than to see Hollow Ridge fall. By the time they emerged from the tunnel entrance near the eastern wall, the sky above had shifted from black to the deep gray of early morning, and the sounds of battle had quieted into the exhausted silence that followed a long night of fighting. Damon was waiting near the cellar entrance, his eyes finding Elena immediately, as she stepped into the pale light, and for just a moment, the mask of the Alpha King slipped away entirely, replaced by something rawer, something that looked almost like relief. "You found it," he said, staring at the supplies Owen carried behind her. "I told you I would," Elena said, setting down her own load and allowing herself, finally, to breathe. Damon crossed the distance between them in a few quick strides, his hand rising as if to touch her face before he caught himself, remembering the warriors still moving around them, remembering the roles they both had to maintain in front of a pack that depended on their strength. Instead, he let his hand fall to her shoulder, gripping it firmly, his eyes searching hers with something unspoken. "You should not have gone yourself." "There was no one else who remembered the way," Elena said simply. "You know that." He did know it, and the knowledge sat uneasily in his chest, the same way it always did whenever Elena's long memory became the thing that saved his pack. It was a gift, yes, an invaluable one, but it was also a reminder of everything he did not fully understand about the bond that connected them, a reminder that Elena carried centuries of knowledge and pain that he could only glimpse in fragments, never the whole picture. Around them, word began to spread through the courtyard about the discovery beneath the ridge, and Elena watched as exhausted warriors, mothers holding hungry children, and elders who had begun preparing for the worst, all turned toward her with expressions of disbelief and gratitude. She had done this before, more times than she could easily count, pulling solutions from memories that stretched back further than anyone else in Hollow Ridge could imagine, and each time, the pack's relief settled over her like a warm blanket that never quite reached the cold places inside her. Damon called a brief gathering near the central fire pit as the sun rose fully over the battered walls of Hollow Ridge, announcing the discovery of new supplies and outlining a stricter rationing plan that would stretch what they had until reinforcements could break through the siege lines. Elena stood at the edge of the gathering, watching him speak with the quiet authority that had defined him since the day he first became Alpha, and she felt, not for the first time, a flicker of something bittersweet beneath her exhaustion. She had helped build this. All of it. The walls, the alliances, the careful systems that kept Hollow Ridge functioning, even in its darkest hours. And yet, standing at the edge of the fire pit's warm light while Damon addressed his people, she understood, quietly and without bitterness, that she would always be the one working in shadows and tunnels, while he stood in the light where the pack could see him. It was not resentment, not yet. It was simply the shape their bond had taken over 2 centuries, a shape she had accepted so long ago that she rarely questioned it anymore. But something about this siege, about the exhaustion pressing deeper into her bones than any previous crisis had managed, made the old shape feel heavier than it used to. As the gathering ended and warriors dispersed to their posts, Damon found her again near the cellar entrance, his expression softer, now that the immediate danger had passed, if only for a few hours. "Get some rest," he said. "You have done enough for one night." "There is still the matter of distributing the new supplies," Elena said, already turning toward the ledger she had left near the cellar stairs. "Elena." His voice stopped her, quiet but firm, and when she turned back to face him, she saw something in his eyes she had not seen in a long time, something that looked almost like worry. "You cannot carry this pack alone, not forever." "I am not carrying it alone," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she was not entirely certain she believed them. And Damon stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him even through the cold morning air, close enough that the bond between them hummed faintly beneath her skin, the way it always did in his presence, a low, steady pulse that had connected them since the very first night they met, over 2.5 centuries ago, when neither of them could have imagined how long that connection would last, or what it would eventually cost. "You have kept this pack alive through more sieges than I can count," he said quietly. "But I have never once asked what it costs you to do it. That ends tonight. When this siege is over, we will talk, truly talk, about all of it." Elena searched his face, looking for the deflection she had grown used to over the years, the careful way he avoided conversations that ventured too close to the true weight of their bond. But this time, she found only sincerity, raw and unguarded, and for a moment, hope flickered in her chest, fragile but real. "All right," she said softly, "when this siege is over." Neither of them could have known, standing there in the pale morning light with the smell of smoke still clinging to the air, that the siege would end far sooner than expected, or that the conversation Damon promised would come too late to change the course already set in motion, 261 years in the making, now finally beginning to unravel. Elena picked up her ledger and turned toward the cellar stairs, ready to continue the work that had defined her existence for longer than most creatures lived at all, unaware that the choice she would make in the days ahead would test everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed, and everything she had ever believed about the bond that had shaped the entire course of her impossibly long life. 261 years earlier, the land that would one day become Hollow Ridge had belonged to no one and everyone at once, a stretch of forest and river valley fought over by scattered wolf packs and struggling human settlements that rarely trusted one another enough to share a fire, let alone a future. Elena had been young then, though not as young as the villagers around her assumed. She had already lived through 2 hard winters that killed half her settlement, already buried more people than any girl her age should have had to bury, and she had learned early that survival belonged only to those willing to make decisions no one else wanted to make. Her village sat at the edge of a river that flooded every spring, wiping out crops before they could be harvested, and by the time the 3rd famine came, the elders had run out of ideas, grain stores were empty, hunting parties returned with less each week. Sickness had begun creeping through the youngest children, the kind that came from empty stomachs rather than any plague. Elena, barely more than a girl in the eyes of the village council, had watched her neighbors debate abandoning their homes entirely, scattering into the wilderness in search of any place that might offer mercy. It was during that desperate season that the wolves came, not as attackers, but as refugees of their own kind of disaster. A rival pack had driven a smaller group from their territory to the north, and the survivors, exhausted and injured, had stumbled into the edges of Elena's village, seeking nothing more than a place to rest, before continuing their retreat. Among them was a young wolf, barely past his own transition into leadership, thin from weeks of running. His authority as alpha still new enough that it sat uneasily on his shoulders. His name was Damon, though at the time, Elena knew him only as the wounded stranger, who collapsed near the village well, too proud to ask for help even as blood soaked through the fur along his side. Most of the villagers wanted nothing to do with wolves, afraid of old stories about beasts that hunted humans in the dark. But Elena had never much cared for old stories. She saw a creature in pain, and pain, to her, demanded a response regardless of what shape it wore. She had knelt beside him in the mud near the well, ignoring the frightened murmurs of her neighbors, and began cleaning the wound, with hands that already knew more about healing than most trained physicians twice her age. "You should not help me," Damon had said through gritted teeth, his voice rough with exhaustion and pain. "Your people fear mine." "My people fear a lot of things that will not actually kill them," Elena had answered, not looking up from her work. "Hunger will kill them. You will not." It was the kind of blunt honesty that would come to define their entire relationship, though neither of them understood that yet. Damon had studied her in silence as she worked, something shifting behind his exhausted eyes, some recognition of a mind as sharp and unyielding as his own. Over the following days, as Damon's pack recovered enough strength to consider their next move, an uneasy alliance began to form between the wolves and the villagers, built entirely on Elena's insistence that both groups needed exactly what the other could offer. The wolves needed food and shelter to heal. The villagers needed protection from the raiders who had begun testing their weakened defenses, sensing an opportunity in their suffering. It was Elena who proposed the arrangement to the village council, standing before men 3 times her age, and refusing to back down even as they laughed at the idea of trusting wolves with their safety. "You are already trusting hunger with your lives," she had told them. "At least the wolves offer something in return." The council, desperate enough to consider anything, agreed to a trial arrangement, and Elena became the bridge between 2 worlds that had never learned to speak the same language. She organized hunting parties that combined human trackers with wolf strength, arranged shelter for the pack within the village's outer buildings, and slowly, carefully, built the kind of trust that took most alliances generations to form. Damon, still healing, found himself drawn to her not out of instinct or romance, but out of something rarer, a genuine respect for a mind that matched his own in its refusal to accept defeat. They spent long evenings near the village fire, discussing strategy. planning defenses against the raiders who continued to circle the valley. And somewhere in those quiet conversations, something began to grow between them that neither had words for yet. The bond formed on the night the raiders finally attacked in full force, a night that tested everything the fragile alliance between wolves and villagers had built. Elena remembered every detail of it even now, 261 years later, the way memory sometimes preserved only the moments that mattered most, sharp and unfading, while everything else blurred with time. The raiders had come at midnight, torches burning against the dark, and the village's makeshift defenses had nearly broken under the assault. Damon fought at the front line, his pack beside him, but the numbers had been overwhelming, and Elena, refusing to hide with the other villagers, had run through the chaos carrying water and bandages to wherever the fighting was thickest, ignoring every warning shouted her way. She found Damon collapsed near the village gate, a wound across his chest deep enough that even his enhanced healing could not close it fast enough to save him. The raiders were closing in, and Elena, with nothing but her own stubbornness and desperation, had done something no healer in her village had ever attempted. She had pressed her hands against his wound and poured every ounce of will she possessed into keeping him alive, whispering words she barely understood herself, some instinct older than reason guiding her actions. What happened next existed in memory more as sensation than clear event, a warmth spreading between them that had nothing to do with blood loss or fever, a connection snapping into place, like something that had always been waiting to exist. Damon's wound had closed faster than it should have. Elena had felt something settle into her chest that never fully left again, a tether stretching between her heart and his that would outlast every human lifespan she had ever expected to live. The raiders were repelled before dawn, driven back by a combined force of desperate villagers and wolves, fighting with a ferocity born from protecting something worth saving. When the sun rose over the battered village, Elena and Damon stood together near the gate, both changed in ways neither fully understood yet, connected by something that the old wolves in his pack would later explain as a bond rarer than any mating tie, a partnership sealed not by instinct but by mutual sacrifice freely given. The elder who first recognized what had happened was an aging wolf named Grace, one of the few survivors from Damon's original pack before the raiders had scattered them. She had watched the exchange near the gate with old, knowing eyes, and later that day, she pulled Elena aside with a seriousness that startled the young human woman. "Do you understand what you have done?" Grace had asked her. "I saved his life," Elena had answered simply. "You have tied your life to his," Grace corrected gently. "The bond you formed does not work the way a mating bond does. It is older, rarer. It ties itself to those willing to give everything for another without asking anything in return. It will not fade with time, the way ordinary bonds sometimes do, and it will not let you age the way ordinary humans do. Not fully, not while it remains unbroken." Elena had not fully believed her at first, too young and too consumed by the urgent work of rebuilding her village to think much about the strange warmth still settled in her chest. But as the years passed, as her childhood friends grew old and gray, while she remained largely unchanged, the truth of Grace's words became impossible to ignore. She had tied herself, without fully understanding what she was doing, to a creature whose lifespan already stretched far beyond a normal human's, and in doing so, had inherited something of that same endurance. Damon had struggled with the implications more than she had, in those early years. He had not asked for the bond, had not understood the weight he was placing on a young woman barely out of childhood, when he allowed himself to lean on her strength during his recovery. There had been nights, in those first decades, when he tried to distance himself from her, convinced that tying her fate so completely to his was a kind of theft, stealing a normal human life from someone who deserved the chance to live it. But Elena had never wanted a normal life, not really. She had wanted purpose, and in the growing pack that Damon eventually built into the powerful territory of Hollow Ridge, she found more purpose than any ordinary human existence could have offered her. She became the healer every wolf trusted, the strategist every council consulted, the quiet force behind decades of decisions that kept the pack thriving, even as the world around them shifted and changed with the passing centuries. Their bond, unlike ordinary mating ties, never demanded romance, though something like it had grown between them slowly over the decades, tangled and complicated and never quite named by either of them. What it demanded instead was partnership, an unbreakable commitment to each other's survival that had carried them both through wars, famines, betrayals, and the slow, strange grief of watching generations of pack members live full lives, while Elena remained largely unchanged, an ancient presence wearing the face of someone far younger than her true age. By the time the present siege had begun testing Hollow Ridge's walls, Elena had long since stopped counting the number of crises she had solved, the number of times her long memory and stubborn refusal to accept defeat had pulled the pack back from the edge of ruin. She had become, in the eyes of nearly everyone in Hollow Ridge, something closer to legend than person, a fixture as permanent as the walls themselves, expected to endure whatever came without complaint, because she always had. What none of them understood, not even Damon in the busy urgency of leading his pack through danger after danger, was that endurance was not the same thing as invulnerability. The bond that had kept her alive far longer than any mortal should live had never explained what it would cost her to carry that life for so long, what price accumulated quietly in the spaces between crises, unnoticed until it grew too large to ignore. Elena had felt the first signs of that cost only recently, small things at first, a weariness that sleep no longer fully cured, a faint ache in her chest that came and went without explanation. She had said nothing to anyone, not even to Damon, telling herself it was simply the exhaustion of the siege, nothing more than the natural toll of long nights and constant danger. But some quiet part of her, the part that remembered Grace's warning from over 2 centuries ago, wondered if something deeper was beginning to shift beneath the surface of the bond that had defined her entire existence. As dawn fully broke over Hollow Ridge on the morning after the tunnel discovery, Elena climbed the cellar stairs one more time, her ledger tucked beneath her arm, ready to begin the exhausting work of distributing the new supplies among a pack that depended on her more than they realized. She did not yet know that the ache in her chest was the first quiet warning of something far more serious, a fracture beginning to form in a bond that had held strong for 261 years, one that would eventually force her to make a choice no one in Hollow Ridge, not even Damon, would see coming. By midday, the courtyard of Hollow Ridge had settled into the strange rhythm that always followed a hard night of fighting, a mixture of exhausted relief and quiet dread, since everyone knew the siege was far from over. Elena moved among the pack with her ledger, distributing small portions of the newly recovered supplies to families who had gone 2 days without a proper meal, keeping careful track of every measure so that nothing would run out before the next tunnel trip could bring more. She had learned long ago that surviving a siege was not about grand gestures or single dramatic victories. It was about the smaller, unglamorous work of making sure grain stretched far enough, that wounds were cleaned before they turned to fever, that morale held together even when hope seemed thin. It was work that rarely earned praise, work that happened in the background while warriors received the songs and the gratitude, and Elena had accepted that arrangement so long ago that she no longer thought much about it. Still, there was a particular kind of tiredness settling into her bones this time that felt different from the exhaustion she remembered from previous crises. She noticed it most clearly in the quiet moments, when she paused between tasks and felt her own heartbeat, slower and heavier than it should have been, or when she caught her reflection in a water barrel and saw shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of rest seemed to lift anymore. She told herself it was nothing. She had survived worse sieges than this one. She had gone longer without sleep, carried heavier burdens, walked further distances through more dangerous terrain. There was no reason this particular crisis should feel any different from the dozens that had come before it, across 2.5 centuries of service, to a pack that had grown, prospered, and depended on her steady presence through every generation. And yet, that evening, as she knelt beside a young mother named Clara, checking her infant son for signs of the fever that had been spreading among the pack's youngest members, Elena felt a sudden wave of dizziness pass over her, sharp enough that she had to steady herself against the wall to keep from falling. Clara, exhausted but sharp-eyed despite her own worry, noticed immediately. "Elena, are you well?" "Just tired," Elena said, forcing a reassuring smile as the dizziness passed. "It has been a long few days for all of us." Clara did not look entirely convinced, but she said nothing further, too consumed by worry for her son's fever to press the matter. Elena finished her examination, relieved to find the child's fever had not worsened, and gave Clara careful instructions for the herbal tea that would help bring it down over the coming days. It was only after she left the small dwelling, stepping back out into the cool evening air, that she allowed herself a moment to simply stand still and breathe, waiting for the strange heaviness in her chest to settle. It did not fully settle. It simply faded to a dull, background ache that she had grown accustomed to ignoring, the way she had learned to ignore so many small discomforts over the centuries in favor of the larger crises that always demanded her attention first. She found Owen near the eastern wall, organizing the next planned trip through the tunnels to retrieve more supplies from the abandoned trading post. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting slightly at whatever he saw in her face. "You look unwell," he said bluntly, the kind of honesty that came easily between old allies who had long since dispensed with unnecessary courtesy. "I am fine," Elena said, the same automatic reassurance she had given Clara only an hour earlier. "How many more trips do you think we will need before the supplies are fully secured?" Owen studied her for a moment longer than she would have liked, clearly unconvinced, but he let the matter drop, understanding that Elena rarely appreciated being pressed on questions of her own well-being. "At least 3 more, if we want enough to last until reinforcements break through. The enemy has not noticed the tunnel entrance yet, but that luck will not hold forever." "Then we should not waste the time we have," Elena said, already turning toward the cellar stairs. "I will go with the next group at nightfall." "Elena." Owen's voice stopped her again, the same careful concern she had heard from Damon the night before. "You have gone on every trip so far. Let someone else lead this one. You need rest." "There is no one else who can navigate those tunnels as quickly as I can," Elena said. And though the words were true, she recognized, somewhere beneath her stubborn insistence, that she was also avoiding the quiet dread that came with sitting still, long enough to notice how tired she truly felt. Movement, purpose, constant work, these had always been her armor against the strange weight of carrying so many years inside a body that no longer aged the way it should. Owen did not argue further, though his expression made clear he disagreed with her decision. Elena left him organizing supplies and made her way toward the healer's quarters near the center of the settlement, intending to rest for a few hours before the night's tunnel trip, though rest, she knew, would likely elude her the way it usually did during a crisis this severe. She found Damon waiting for her there, seated near the small fire in her quarters, his broad frame looking strangely out of place among the shelves of herbs and healing supplies that filled the room. He rose when she entered, his eyes immediately searching her face with the same careful attention Owen and Clara had shown earlier that day. "Owen told me you nearly collapsed," he said. No preamble, straight to the point in the way he always was when something worried him deeply. "I did not collapse," Elena said, though she could hear how thin the denial sounded, even to her own ears. "I was dizzy for a moment. It happens. I have not slept properly in days." Damon crossed the small room and took her hands in his touch warm and grounding, in a way that had steadied her through countless crises over the centuries. "Sit down, please." Elena sat, more out of exhaustion than genuine agreement, and Damon knelt beside her chair, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she did not. "I need you to be honest with me," he said quietly. "Has this happened before? The dizziness, the fatigue that will not lift no matter how much you rest?" Elena hesitated, and that hesitation told Damon everything he needed to know before she even answered. "A few times," she admitted finally, "over the past several months. It comes and goes. I assumed it was simply the wear of carrying so many years, nothing more serious than that." Damon's jaw tightened, and Elena recognized the particular stillness that came over him whenever he was fighting to control fear rather than anger. "You should have told me sooner." "There was nothing to tell," Elena said. "You have had wars to fight, alliances to manage, a pact to protect. I did not want to add my own tiredness to that burden." "Elena." Damon's voice cracked slightly on her name, something raw slipping through the careful composure he usually maintained. "You are not a burden. You have never been a burden. You are the reason this pack has survived every crisis it has faced for over 2 centuries. If something is wrong with the bond, with you, I need to know. I cannot protect what I do not understand." Elena looked away from him, toward the small fire crackling in the corner of the room, memories of Grace's old warning stirring uncomfortably in her mind. She had never told Damon the full details of that conversation from centuries ago, the warning about bonds that did not fade but could, under the right circumstances, eventually break, taking something vital with them when they did. "I do not know what is wrong," she said honestly. "I only know that I feel tired in a way I have not felt before. It may be nothing. It may simply be the strain of this particular siege, worse than others we have survived. And if it is not nothing?" Elena did not have an answer for that question, not one she was ready to give voice to, not while the siege still raged outside the walls of Hollow Ridge, and the pack still depended on her steady presence to hold everything together. She squeezed Damon's hands gently, offering what reassurance she could manage. "Then we will face it together, the way we have faced everything else. But not tonight. Tonight there is still work to do, and I intend to do it." Damon wanted to argue. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, but he also knew, after 2.5 centuries of partnership, that arguing with Elena once she had made a decision rarely accomplished anything beyond frustrating them both. He rose from where he knelt beside her chair, though he did not release her hands entirely. "Rest for a few hours at least," he said, "before the tunnel trip tonight. That much, I am asking of you." Elena agreed, mostly to ease the worry etched across his features, though she doubted true rest would come easily, with so many thoughts circling through her mind. Damon lingered a moment longer, studying her face, as if trying to memorize something he feared might soon change, before finally turning to leave, his duties as Alpha, pulling him back toward the courtyard, where warriors waited for orders regarding the ongoing siege. Alone in her quarters, Elena allowed herself, finally, a moment of honest reflection. She thought of Grace, dead now for over a century, and the warning she had given a much younger Elena so long ago. A bond stretched too thin for too long does not heal. It snaps. She thought of the centuries she had spent pouring herself into this pack, into this bond, never once questioning whether there might be a limit to what she could give, before something inside her finally ran dry. She thought, too, of Damon's face when he had knelt beside her chair, the raw fear beneath his careful composure, and something in her chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with whatever illness might be settling into her body. 261 years, and she still was not entirely certain whether the bond between them had ever fully become what the old stories called love, or whether it remained, even now, something more complicated. A partnership built on necessity that had simply grown comfortable enough to resemble affection. She did not have time to untangle that question tonight, not with the siege still demanding every ounce of strength and focus she possessed. She rose from her chair, gathered her supplies for the coming tunnel trip, and pushed the uncertainty to the back of her mind, the way she had learned to push aside so many uncertainties over the long, strange span of her impossibly extended life. But the ache remained, quiet and persistent, a small crack forming in a foundation that had held strong for over 2 centuries, one that would only continue to grow as the siege wore on, and the true cost of Elena's endless service to Hollow Ridge finally began revealing itself, piece by painful piece. The days that followed blurred together into a relentless cycle of tunnel trips, ration distribution, and battle preparation, and Elena found herself pulled deeper into the machinery of the siege, even as the ache in her chest grew steadily harder to ignore. Damon, consumed by war councils and the constant pressure of holding his warriors together against an enemy that showed no sign of retreating, leaned on her more heavily than he perhaps realized, trusting her resourcefulness the way he always had, without pausing to notice how much it was costing her to provide it. It was not cruelty on his part, Elena reminded herself often during those exhausting days. It was simply the nature of crisis, the way urgent problems consumed all available attention, leaving little room for anyone to notice the quiet suffering of the person solving them. She had watched this pattern repeat itself many times across the centuries, crisis after crisis demanding her strength, while her own needs faded into the background, unnoticed, until the danger passed, and there was finally room to breathe. This time, though, she was not certain the danger would pass before something inside her gave way entirely. She began keeping a private record, separate from the official ledger she used to track the pack's dwindling supplies, a small journal, hidden among her healing texts, where she noted the frequency of her dizzy spells, the growing fatigue that no amount of sleep seemed to cure, the strange moments when her own heartbeat felt distant and slow beneath her fingers, as if some vital current inside her was running thinner than it used to. She did not fully understand what these symptoms meant, but some old instinct, perhaps inherited from the very bond that had extended her life in the first place, told her they mattered, that ignoring them would not make them disappear. Owen noticed her declining energy more than anyone else during those days, spending long hours beside her in the tunnels as they made trip after trip retrieving supplies from the trading post beneath the ridge. He said little about it directly, respecting her evident desire to keep the matter private, but he began quietly adjusting their workload, taking on tasks that Elena would normally have insisted on handling herself, giving her small moments of rest, disguised as necessary delegation. "You do not need to carry every crate yourself," he told her one evening, gently taking a heavy sack of grain from her hands before she could protest. "Let the rest of us share this burden. That is what a pack is for." Elena wanted to argue, the old instinct to remain indispensable rising automatically, but something in Owen's steady gaze made her pause. She had spent so many centuries being the one who solved every problem, who carried every burden without complaint, that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to let someone else share the weight. It was uncomfortable, unfamiliar, and yet, as she allowed Owen to take the sack from her hands, she felt a small measure of relief mixed with the discomfort, a quiet acknowledgement that perhaps she had been carrying more than any single person should carry alone for so many years. Damon, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of just how much the siege was draining her, his attention consumed by the constant demands of leadership. Every day brought new reports of enemy movements, new decisions about defense strategy, new conversations with anxious pack members who needed reassurance that Hollow Ridge would survive this crisis the way it had survived every crisis before. He trusted Elena to handle the logistics of feeding and healing the pack, the same way he trusted his own instincts in battle, an assumption so deeply ingrained after 2.5 centuries of partnership that he rarely paused to question whether that trust placed an unfair weight on her shoulders. It was not until the 7th day of the siege, during a rare quiet evening when the enemy's attacks had temporarily lessened, that Damon finally noticed the true extent of what Elena had been hiding from him. He found her in the healer's quarters again, this time slumped in her chair near the fire, her private journal open on her lap, though she had not heard him enter, and made no move to hide it before he saw the careful, worried notes filling its pages. He approached slowly, reading over her shoulder before she could stop him, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he took in the details she had recorded. "Elena." His voice was quiet, but the alarm in it was unmistakable. "How long has this been happening?" Elena startled, closing the journal quickly, though the damage was already done. "It is not as serious as it looks written down like that. You have written down at least a dozen instances of dizziness, fatigue severe enough to affect your work, moments where your own heartbeat felt wrong to you." Damon knelt beside her chair, his hands gently but firmly taking the journal from her lap, setting it aside so he could hold her hands instead, searching her face with an intensity that made her chest ache in an entirely different way than her mysterious illness did. "This has been happening for months, Elena. Why did you not tell me sooner?" "Because there was nothing you could do about it," Elena said, the honesty slipping out before she could stop it, exhaustion wearing away at the careful composure she usually maintained around him. "You have a pack to protect, a war to fight. I did not want my own tiredness to become another burden on top of everything else you are carrying." "You are not a burden," Damon said again, the same words he had used days earlier, though this time his voice carried a rawness that made the sentiment land differently, deeper. "How many times must I say this before you believe it? Elena, you have given this pack 261 years of your life. You have solved crises no one else could solve, healed wounds no one else could heal, kept us fed and sheltered through wars and famines that would have destroyed us without you. If something is wrong with you, with the bond that has sustained you all this time, that is not a burden. That is the single most important thing happening in Hollow Ridge right now, more important than any siege." Elena felt something crack open inside her chest at his words, not the physical ache she had been hiding, but something older and more emotional, a wound she had not fully realized she carried, until he named it so directly. She had spent so many centuries believing her own well-being mattered less than the pack's survival, that her role was simply to give and give, until there was nothing left to give, that hearing Damon insist otherwise felt almost disorienting, like a language she had forgotten how to understand. "I do not know what is happening to me," she admitted quietly, finally allowing the full weight of her fear to show in her voice. "I do not know if it is simply exhaustion, or something deeper, something related to the bond itself. I have not felt this way before, not in 2.5 centuries of carrying it. Damon's grip on her hands tightened slightly, his jaw working as he processed the implications of what she was telling him. Do you remember anything from when the bond first formed? Anything the old wolves might have told you about what happens to a bond like ours over time? Elena hesitated, Grace's warning surfacing again in her memory, the old words she had never fully shared with Damon because they had seemed, for over 200 years, entirely theoretical, a caution that need not apply to a bond as strong and enduring as theirs had proven to be. But sitting here now, with the ache in her chest, a constant, undeniable presence, the theoretical warning suddenly felt far more urgent than it ever had before. Grace told me once, long ago, that a bond stretched too thin for too long does not simply fade, Elena said slowly. She said it breaks. And when it breaks, it can take the weaker party's life force with it. Damon went very still, the color draining slightly from his face as the weight of her words settled over him. And you never told me this. It seemed unimportant at the time, Elena said. We had survived so much together already. I did not think our bond would ever reach a breaking point. But you think it might now. It was not a question, and Elena did not have the strength to deny it any longer. Not with Damon's eyes searching hers with such raw fear, such genuine desperation to understand what was happening to her. I do not know, she said honestly, but I fear it might. Damon was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing absent patterns across the back of her hand as he processed this new, terrifying possibility. When he finally spoke again, his voice was rough with an emotion Elena had rarely heard from him in all their centuries together, something that sounded dangerously close to grief. I will not lose you, he said fiercely. Not to this siege, not to some ancient warning about bonds breaking. We will find a way to fix this, Elena. I promise you that. Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the fierce certainty in his voice, as if it could somehow guarantee the outcome he was promising. But some quiet, exhausted part of her, the part that had spent 261 years learning the difference between hope and reality, wondered if this was a promise Damon might not be able to keep, no matter how much he wanted to. Outside, the sounds of renewed fighting began drifting toward the healers' quarters, the brief lull in the siege apparently coming to an end, as enemy forces resumed their assault on Hollow Ridge's battered walls. Damon's expression shifted immediately, the Alpha King rising to meet the demands of his pack even as the healers' quarters, and the frightening conversation they had just shared, called him to stay. Go, Elena said softly, understanding the pull of duty even in this moment of vulnerability. Your pack needs you. This conversation is not finished, Damon said, rising reluctantly to his feet, his eyes still holding hers with fierce intensity. When this siege ends, we will find answers, I swear it. Elena nodded, watching him leave the small room, his broad shoulders squaring back into the posture of command, even as she could see the lingering worry still etched across his features. Alone again, she picked up her journal, staring down at the careful notes she had recorded over the past several months, and felt, for the first time since the strange symptoms had begun, a small measure of relief, simply from no longer carrying the secret alone. But relief and solutions were different things, and as the sounds of battle grew louder outside her window, Elena understood, with a clarity that settled deep into her bones, that the coming days would demand answers neither she nor Damon were fully prepared to face. The following morning, Elena sought out the only living wolf in Hollow Ridge, old enough to remember the same era of bond lore that Grace had once spoken of, an elder named Henry who had served the pack for over 150 years, and carried within his memory fragments of knowledge that had faded from common understanding among the younger generations. She found him near the healer's garden, tending carefully to the herbs that had survived the siege's early damage, his weathered hands moving with the same patience they always did, unhurried, despite the chaos surrounding the settlement. Elena, he greeted her, not looking up immediately from his work. You look like someone carrying a question too heavy to ask directly. Best to simply ask it. Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile at his characteristic bluntness, settling onto the low stone wall beside the garden. Do you remember anything about bonds like mine and Damon's? Not mating bonds, but the older kind, formed through sacrifice rather than instinct? Henry's hands stilled among the herbs, and when he finally looked up at her, His expression had shifted into something more serious, more guarded. Grace spoke to you about this once, did she not? A long time ago, before she passed. She warned me that such bonds could break if stretched too thin for too long, Elena said. She said the consequences would be severe. I did not understand then how seriously to take that warning. Henry sighed, setting down the herbs he had been tending, and turning to face her fully, his old eyes carrying the particular weight of someone about to share knowledge they had hoped never to need. The bonds Grace spoke of are rare enough that most in our current generation know only fragments of the old teachings. What I remember comes from my own grandmother, who lived through an era when such bonds were slightly more common, back when human and wolf alliances were newer, more desperate, more likely to produce the kind of mutual sacrifice that creates a tie like yours. Tell me what you remember, Elena said, unable to keep the urgency from her voice. Henry studied her for a long moment before continuing, choosing his words with obvious care. A sacrifice bond, as my grandmother called it, forms when two beings give everything for each other, in a single, desperate moment, the way you gave everything to save Damon's life all those centuries ago. Unlike a mating bond, which settles into a natural rhythm and simply exists, a sacrifice bond requires continued balance to remain stable. Both parties must give and receive in relatively equal measure, or the bond begins to strain. And if the balance is lost? Elena asked, though some part of her already sensed the answer, had sensed it in the growing ache within her chest for months now. Then the weaker party, whoever has given more than they have received, begins to suffer the consequences, Henry said gently. The bond does not simply weaken evenly between two people. It draws more heavily from whoever has less remaining to give, slowly, and then, near the end, quite suddenly. If nothing changes the balance, the bond eventually breaks entirely, and the toll it takes when it does can be severe, sometimes fatal, for the party who has been giving the most. Elena absorbed this information in silence, the pieces of her own experience over the past several months, clicking into place, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, even as the underlying truth terrified her. 261 years of giving, of solving crises and healing wounds, and carrying the weight of an entire pack's survival, while Damon, consumed by the equally demanding but different burden of leadership, had given what he could, but never quite matched the constant, relentless output she had poured into their bond, and into Hollow Ridge itself. How does one restore the balance, she asked quietly, once it has been lost for so long? Henry's expression grew even more somber. That, Elena, I do not fully know. My grandmother spoke of such bonds breaking, of the tragic consequences that followed, but she never described a case where the balance was successfully restored, after drifting as far as yours appears to have drifted. It may be possible. I simply do not have the knowledge to tell you how. The words settled over Elena like a physical weight, and for a moment, she found it difficult to breathe, the ache in her chest suddenly feeling less like an abstract symptom, and more like a countdown she could not see the end of. Henry, noticing her distress, reached out and placed a gentle, weathered hand on her shoulder. You should tell Damon the full truth of this, he said quietly. Not just that something feels wrong, but the actual danger you may be facing. I already told him some of it, Elena admitted, but not the possibility that it might be fatal. He is already carrying the weight of this siege, of protecting the entire pack. I do not want to add the fear of losing me to that burden, not while he needs every ounce of focus to keep Hollow Ridge standing. Henry's expression turned disapproving, though his voice remained gentle. Elena, you have spent 261 years protecting this pack from every hardship you could shield them from. But you cannot protect Damon from the truth of what is happening to you, not if it means he loses you, without ever having the chance to understand why, or to try to save you. That would be a far crueler outcome than the burden of simply knowing. Elena knew, somewhere beneath her instinct to protect everyone around her from unnecessary worry, that Henry was right. But the habit of self-sacrifice ran so deep in her, cultivated over centuries of putting the pack's needs above her own, that even now, facing what might be a genuine threat to her life, her first instinct remained to shield Damon from the full weight of that danger, rather than burden him with it, during a crisis that already demanded everything he had to give. She thanked Henry for his honesty, promising to consider his advice, though even as she said the words, she was not entirely certain she would follow through on them. The siege still raged outside the walls, warriors still needed tending, supplies still needed distributing, and somewhere in the exhausting demands of each day, Elena found it easier to postpone the difficult conversation Henry had urged her to have, telling herself there would be time for it once the immediate crisis passed. That evening, as she prepared for another tunnel trip to retrieve the remaining supplies from the trading post, she caught Owen watching her with a careful, assessing look that suggested he had noticed more of her decline than she had realized. "You should not be going tonight," he said, his voice carrying the particular firmness he rarely used, reserved for moments when he genuinely believed a decision needed correcting. "You have not looked well in days, Elena. Let me lead this trip alone." "I know these tunnels better than anyone," Elena said, the familiar argument rising automatically, even as her body protested the idea of another long night of physical exertion. "You know them well enough to have taught me the route already," Owen countered. "I do not need you beside me every single time, Elena. Trust me to handle this one." Elena hesitated, torn between her ingrained instinct to remain indispensable and the honest recognition that Owen was likely right, that her body needed rest more urgently than the pack needed her physical presence in the tunnels tonight. After a long moment, she nodded, the concession costing her more than she expected, an admission that she was no longer capable of maintaining the relentless pace she had sustained for so many years. "Be careful," she said instead, "and take Clara's brother with you, in case you need an extra set of hands to carry supplies back." Owen agreed, relief visible in his expression that she had not fought him further on the matter, and Elena watched him go, feeling the strange, unfamiliar weight of having stepped back from a task she would normally have insisted on handling herself. It should have felt like relief, and in some small way it did, but it also felt like the first crack in an identity she had built over 2.5 centuries, the identity of the person who never stopped giving, who never let exhaustion or danger prevent her from doing whatever the pack needed done. She spent the evening instead in the healer's quarters, resting as Damon and Henry had both urged her to, though sleep came only fitfully, interrupted by the persistent ache in her chest, and the weight of Henry's warning settling deeper into her thoughts with every passing hour. A sacrifice bond, drawn too heavily from one side for too long, could break, and when it broke, the consequences could be fatal for the one who had given the most. She thought of Damon, sleeping little himself, as he coordinated the pack's defenses night after night, and wondered, in the quiet darkness of her own uncertainty, whether he would ever fully understand the true cost of everything she had given, not just during this siege, but across the entire span of their impossibly long partnership. She wondered, too, whether understanding that cost now, so late, could possibly be enough to save what remained of the bond that had defined both their lives for over 2 centuries. Outside, the sounds of the ongoing siege continued their relentless rhythm, a reminder that whatever personal crisis Elena now faced, the larger crisis threatening Hollow Ridge had not paused to accommodate it. She closed her eyes, willing sleep to come, despite the fear settled deep in her chest, knowing that whatever answers Henry's warning demanded, she would need whatever strength she could gather to face the days still ahead. 3 days later, the situation at Hollow Ridge took a dangerous turn that would test Elena far beyond anything Henry's warning had prepared her for. Enemy scouts, growing increasingly desperate as their own siege dragged on without the swift victory their leader had promised, discovered signs of activity near the eastern ridge, close enough to the hidden tunnel entrance that Owen's careful reconnaissance revealed a very real danger of discovery within the next day or two. The news reached Elena during a rare quiet moment in the healer's quarters, delivered by Owen himself, with the grim urgency of someone who understood exactly what the discovery would mean for the pack's dwindling hope of surviving until reinforcements arrived. If the enemy found the tunnel, their last remaining source of supplies would be cut off entirely, and Hollow Ridge would face true starvation within days, rather than the manageable scarcity they had been carefully rationing against. "We need one final trip," Owen said, spreading a rough map across the small table in her quarters, to retrieve everything remaining in the trading post, before the enemy closes off that route entirely. "It will need to happen tonight, and it will need to move faster than any trip we have made so far, because we will not have the luxury of caution." Elena studied the map, understanding immediately the scale of what he was proposing. A single trip, carrying as much as possible, moving quickly enough to avoid the increased enemy presence near the ridge, all while navigating tunnels that had already proven treacherous, even under less urgent circumstances. It was a dangerous plan, and every instinct in her recognized that her declining strength made her a liability rather than an asset for such a demanding task. But she also recognized something else, something that outweighed her own fear about the risk to her health. Without this final trip, the pack would face a crisis far more immediate and certain than whatever uncertain danger the bond's fraying balance posed to her personally. Children would go hungry. The elderly and the wounded, already weakened from the ongoing siege, would begin to suffer in ways that could prove fatal, long before any bond-related illness claimed her. "I will go," she said, the decision settling into place with the same quiet certainty that had guided every difficult choice she had made across 2.5 centuries of service to this pack. Owen's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Elena, given what we discussed with Henry, given how you have been feeling, this may not be wise. Let me organize a team without you. You have taught enough of us the route by now." "This trip requires more than knowledge of the route," Elena said, meeting his eyes steadily. "It requires speed and precision, and the ability to make split-second decisions if something goes wrong. I have navigated those tunnels more times than anyone alive. If we are going to move fast enough to succeed, while the enemy's attention is still elsewhere, I need to be there." Owen wanted to argue further, she could see it in the tension across his features, but he also understood, after years of working alongside her, that Elena's decisions, once made with this particular quiet certainty, rarely bent to persuasion. He nodded reluctantly, already shifting his attention to the practical details of organizing the trip, though his worry remained visible in every careful instruction he gave to the small team they assembled for the mission. Elena did not tell Damon the full extent of the danger before the trip began, a decision she would later recognize as a mistake, though in the moment, it felt like the only way to ensure he would not forbid the mission entirely out of fear for her safety. She simply informed him that Owen's reconnaissance had revealed the need for one final, urgent trip to secure the last of the trading post supplies before the enemy discovered the tunnel entrance. Damon's expression tightened immediately upon hearing the plan, his instinct to protect her warring visibly, with his understanding of the pack's desperate need for those supplies. "You should not go on this one," he said, echoing Owen's concern almost exactly. "Send others. You have already given so much." "I need to be there," Elena said simply, unwilling to elaborate further, knowing that if she explained the true danger of the enemy's increased presence near the ridge, Damon's protective instincts would override every practical argument she could offer about the necessity of her involvement. Damon studied her for a long moment, something conflicted and pained flickering behind his eyes, before he finally nodded, though the reluctance in his expression made clear he was not fully at peace with the decision. "Come back to me," he said quietly, pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace that carried more emotion than words could have conveyed. "Whatever happens down there, come back." "I always do," Elena said, though even as she spoke, the familiar reassurance, some quiet part of her wondered if this particular trip might finally test the limits of that promise, in ways none of her previous missions had. The tunnel felt different that night, the air thicker with tension, as Elena led Owen and 2 other warriors through the narrow, winding passage beneath the eastern ridge, moving as quickly as the treacherous footing allowed. Every sound echoing through the darkness sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her already strained body, the constant vigilance required to navigate safely draining her reserves far faster than any previous trip had managed. They reached the trading post's storage chamber without incident, and Elena felt a brief flare of relief as the team began the urgent work of loading as many supplies as they could carry, moving with practiced efficiency, despite the pressure of time weighing on every decision. But the relief proved short-lived. As they prepared to begin the return journey, laden with as much food as they could manage, a distant rumble echoed through the tunnel behind them, followed by the unmistakable sound of enemy voices, closer than any of them had anticipated. "They found the eastern entrance," Owen whispered urgently, his eyes wide with alarm. "We need to move, now." Elena's mind raced through the tunnel's layout, memory stretching back across decades to recall every alternate passage, every hidden branch that might offer an escape route if the main path back to Hollow Ridge had truly been compromised. She found what she needed, a narrower, less stable passage that would add significant time and difficulty to their journey, but would keep them clear of the enemy presence closing in from the east. "This way," she said, gesturing toward the hidden branch, already moving. Despite the growing weakness she could feel spreading through her limbs. It will take longer, but it is our only safe option. The team followed her without question, trusting her memory and judgment, even as the danger around them intensified. The narrow passage proved even more treacherous than Elena remembered. Loose stones and unstable ceiling sections, forcing them to move with painstaking care, even as the urgency of their situation demanded speed. Elena felt her strength failing with every step, the ache in her chest sharpening into something closer to genuine pain. But she pushed forward, refusing to let her own weakness slow the team's desperate escape. Halfway through the narrow passage, disaster nearly struck. A section of the tunnel ceiling, weakened by the enemy's activity somewhere above, began to crumble without warning, sending a shower of loose earth and stone cascading down, directly above where one of the younger warriors, a wolf barely out of his first decade of adulthood, was struggling under the weight of a heavy supply crate. Elena moved without conscious thought, years of instinct and reflexes honed across centuries of crisis, overriding her exhausted body's protests. She shoved the young warrior clear of the collapsing section, taking the brunt of the falling debris across her own shoulder and side, pain exploding through her body as stone and packed earth struck her with brutal force. The tunnel fell into chaos for several long, terrifying moments, dust and debris filling the narrow passage, as Owen and the others scrambled to clear the collapsed section and reach Elena, who had crumpled against the tunnel wall, consciousness wavering dangerously at the edges. Owen reached her first, his hands shaking as he checked for serious injury, relief flooding his features when he confirmed no bones had broken despite the force of the impact. "Elena, can you hear me?" His voice sounded distant, muffled, as if traveling through water rather than open air. Elena tried to respond, but the effort felt impossibly heavy, her body suddenly refusing to cooperate with even the simplest command to speak. The ache in her chest, already sharp before the collapse, had transformed into something far more alarming, a crushing pressure that made each breath feel like a genuine battle. Somewhere in the fog clouding her thoughts, she recognized this sensation was not simply the result of the physical injury from the collapsing debris. Something deeper, something tied to the bond itself, was straining under the exertion of this desperate mission, pushed past whatever fragile balance had remained after months of quiet deterioration. "We need to get her back to Hollow Ridge, now," Owen said urgently to the others, his voice tight with barely controlled panic, as he helped lift Elena carefully, mindful of her injuries, even as the pressing danger of their situation demanded speed. "Move, quickly, but carefully. She cannot take another impact like that." The remaining journey through the tunnel passed in a haze for Elena, consciousness fading in and out, as pain and exhaustion overwhelmed her senses. She was aware only in fragments, Owen's steady voice murmuring reassurance, the rhythmic jostling of being carried, the growing warmth of approaching torchlight as they finally emerged near the cellar entrance back within the walls of Hollow Ridge. Damon's voice reached her before his face came fully into focus, sharp with a fear more raw than she had ever heard from him in over 2 centuries of partnership. "Elena, Elena, stay with me." She wanted to reassure him, wanted to tell him she would be fine, the same automatic reassurance she had offered countless times before across their long shared history. But the words would not come. Her body finally, after 261 years of relentless giving, reaching a limit it could no longer push past through sheer force of will alone. The last thing she registered before darkness finally claimed her fully was Damon's arms lifting her carefully, his voice breaking as he called for help, and the distant, dawning realization in his tone that the crisis he had promised to help her face had arrived far sooner and far more dangerously than either of them had ever prepared for. Elena woke slowly, the world returning to her in fragments of light and sound before settling into full clarity. She lay in her own bed within the healer's quarters, the familiar scent of dried herbs and wood smoke surrounding her, and it took several long moments before she became aware of Damon seated beside the bed, his large frame folded into a chair far too small for him, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that suggested he had not looked away in a very long time. "You are awake," he said quietly, relief flooding his voice as he leaned forward, taking her hand in both of his. "How do you feel?" Elena considered the question honestly, taking stock of her body before answering. The sharp pain from the tunnel collapse had faded to a dull soreness across her shoulder, manageable and clearly healing. But beneath that physical injury, the deeper ache in her chest remained, quieter now but unmistakably present, a reminder that whatever had nearly overwhelmed her in the tunnel had not simply been the result of falling debris. "Tired," she said finally, "but alive. How long have I been unconscious?" 2 full days, Damon said, and the strain evident in his voice told her exactly how difficult those 2 days had been for him. "Henry has been tending to you, alongside the other healers. He believes the physical injuries from the collapse have healed well, but he also believes, and I agree with him, that what happened in that tunnel was about far more than a falling section of ceiling." Elena met his eyes, understanding immediately what he was asking, without him needing to voice the question fully. "The bond," she said quietly. "It nearly broke." Damon's grip on her hand tightened, his expression a careful mask over what she could see was genuine terror beneath the surface. "Henry told me everything, Elena. About the sacrifice bond, about the warning Grace gave you centuries ago, about the danger of the balance being lost for too long. Why did you not tell me the full truth before you went into that tunnel? Why did you let me believe this was simply exhaustion, when you knew, you must have known, how serious the danger truly was?" Elena closed her eyes briefly, gathering the strength to finally speak the truth she had been avoiding for weeks, the truth Henry had urged her to share, and she had continued postponing in favor of the pack's more immediate needs. "Because you had a siege to manage, warriors to lead, an entire pack depending on your focus and strength. I did not want to add the fear of losing me to everything else you were already carrying. I thought I could manage it quietly, the way I have managed everything else across the centuries." "Elena." Damon's voice cracked on her name, the careful composure he had maintained finally beginning to fracture. "Do you understand what nearly happened down there? Owen told me you collapsed the moment you were certain the young warrior was safe, that whatever strength had been holding you together simply gave out the instant the immediate danger passed. Henry believes if that collapse had happened even a few minutes later, deeper in the tunnel, we might not have gotten you back in time." The weight of his words settled heavily over the room, and Elena felt the full reality of how close she had come to death, finally crystallizing in a way the fog of exhaustion and denial had previously kept at bay. "I know," she admitted quietly. "I felt it happening, in the tunnel, something inside me reaching a limit it had never reached before." "And still you did not tell me the truth beforehand," Damon said, though the accusation in his voice was tempered by obvious pain rather than anger. "Elena, I do not understand. After 261 years, after everything we have built together, why would you hide something this important from me?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, searching for words honest enough to capture the tangled instincts that had led her to this point, instincts built across centuries of practiced self-sacrifice that had become so deeply ingrained she rarely questioned them anymore. "Because that is what I have always done," she said finally. "I give and I solve, and I carry whatever burden needs carrying, because that is the role I chose for myself when I saved your life all those centuries ago. I have never learned how to ask for help without feeling as though I am failing at the one thing that has always defined my place in this pack." Damon's expression shifted, something like understanding mixed with a deep, aching sorrow settling into his features. "Elena, your place in this pack was never meant to be defined only by what you give. You are not simply a resource we draw from whenever crisis strikes. You are meant to matter as yourself, not only as the healer who keeps us fed and alive." The words struck something deep in Elena, a truth she had perhaps always sensed, but never fully allowed herself to examine, the quiet, persistent feeling that despite 2.5 centuries of devoted service, she had never quite been seen as anything more than the invaluable resource Damon now insisted she was not. She wanted to believe his words, wanted to accept them as the full truth of how he and the pack truly viewed her, but some quiet, exhausted part of her remained uncertain, remembering countless moments across the centuries when her exhaustion had gone unnoticed, while her contributions were simply expected, assumed, relied upon without question. "I want to believe that," she said honestly. "But Damon, I have spent so long being useful that I no longer know how to be anything else. Even now, lying here injured, my first thought upon waking was whether the supplies we retrieved were enough, whether the pack was still safe, whether I had done enough to justify the risk I took. I did not think of myself at all. Damon's jaw tightened, and he reached up gently to touch her face, his thumb tracing a careful line along her cheek. Then perhaps that is exactly what needs to change. Elena, the bond between us nearly broke because you have spent 2 centuries pouring everything you have into this pack, into me, without ever allowing anything to flow back in equal measure. Henry explained it clearly. The balance must be restored, or we will face this same crisis again, and next time, we may not be fortunate enough to bring you back from it. How do we restore it? Elena asked, the question carrying more vulnerability than she had allowed herself to express in longer than she could remember. Henry told me he does not fully know. Then we will find out together, Damon said firmly. But it begins with you allowing yourself to receive, not just to give. It begins with you trusting that this pack, that I, can carry some of the weight you have carried alone, for far too long. Elena wanted to argue, the old instinct rising automatically, but something in Damon's steady, determined expression made her pause, made her consider, perhaps for the first time in centuries, that the path forward might require her to unlearn habits so deeply ingrained they had become indistinguishable from her own identity. It was a frightening prospect, more frightening in some ways than the physical danger she had just survived, because it demanded a kind of vulnerability she had spent 261 years carefully avoiding. I do not know how to do that, she admitted quietly. I do not know how to simply exist without constantly working to justify my place here. Then we will learn together, Damon said, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss against her forehead, the gesture carrying more tenderness than she could remember from him in a very long time. Starting now, you will rest, fully, without guilt, until Henry says your strength has truly returned. You will let others carry the burdens you have always insisted on carrying alone, and when this siege finally ends, we will find whatever answers exist about restoring balance to bonds like ours, even if it means seeking knowledge beyond what Henry, or anyone else in Hollow Ridge currently possesses. Elena nodded slowly, though even as she agreed, a quiet, uncertain voice at the back of her mind wondered whether 2 centuries of ingrained habit could truly be undone simply through good intentions, however sincere. She had built her entire existence around being indispensable, around proving her worth through constant sacrifice, and the prospect of unlearning that pattern felt, in this vulnerable moment, almost as daunting as the physical danger she had just barely survived. Outside the healer's quarters, the sounds of the ongoing siege continued, a reminder that whatever personal reckoning Elena and Damon were beginning to navigate, the larger crisis facing Hollow Ridge had not paused to accommodate it. But for the first time and longer than Elena could easily remember, she allowed herself, if only for this brief moment, to simply rest in Damon's presence, without immediately turning her thoughts toward the next task, the next crisis, the next way she might prove her continued worth, to a pack she had already given so much of her impossibly long life to protect. It was a small shift, fragile and uncertain, but it was, perhaps, a beginning. The reinforcements Hollow Ridge had been waiting for finally broke through the siege lines 6 days later, arriving at dawn in a coordinated assault that caught the exhausted enemy forces off guard and shattered the remaining will of an army that had already been stretched thin by weeks of fighting a defense far more resilient than they had anticipated. Elena, still regaining her strength under Henry's careful supervision, watched the final battle unfold from the safety of the inner courtyard, unable to fight but unwilling to hide away entirely, while her pack faced the culmination of everything they had endured together. Damon led the counterattack himself, fighting with a ferocity that seemed to draw strength from every ounce of fear and frustration the past weeks had built within him, and by midday, the enemy forces had retreated entirely, driven back beyond the valley's edge by warriors who fought not just for territory, but for the home and family they had spent weeks defending against overwhelming odds. The celebration that followed that evening was unlike anything Elena had witnessed in decades, an outpouring of relief and joy that swept through every corner of Hollow Ridge as the pack finally allowed themselves to release the tension they had carried through the long siege. Fires burned bright in the central courtyard, food from the recovered supplies was shared freely for the first time in weeks, and warriors who had fought side by side through the darkest days of the crisis embraced each other with the particular fierce gratitude that only shared survival could produce. Elena moved through the celebration slowly, still favoring her healing shoulder, accepting the grateful embraces and words of thanks that came from pack members who understood, at least in part, how much her efforts had contributed to their survival. Clara found her early in the evening, pulling her into a warm embrace, and thanking her again for the herbal remedies that had helped her son's fever break during the siege's darkest days. "We would not have survived without you," Clara said sincerely, her eyes bright with genuine gratitude. "Everyone knows it, even if they do not always say it aloud." Elena accepted the words graciously, though something in Clara's phrasing settled uncomfortably in her chest. Everyone knows it, even if they do not always say it aloud. It was a truth she had lived with for centuries, the quiet, unspoken assumption that her contributions were valuable but somehow expected, a resource the pack drew upon without ever fully acknowledging the cost of what she gave. That uncomfortable feeling deepened later in the evening, when Damon called together his council of senior warriors and advisors to formally celebrate the pack's victory and discuss the path forward toward rebuilding what the siege had damaged. Elena stood near the edge of the gathering, still recovering, and therefore not expected to participate directly, listening as the council members praised Damon's leadership, praised the warriors' courage in battle, praised Owen's steady coordination of the tunnel missions that had kept the pack fed. Her own name was mentioned only briefly, in passing, a quick acknowledgement of her contribution to the supply missions, before the conversation moved swiftly on to matters of rebuilding and future defense strategy. It was not malicious. She understood that clearly, even as the small omission stung more than she expected it to. It was simply the pattern that had defined her role in Hollow Ridge for as long as she could remember, her contributions treated as a given, a background function of the pack's survival rather than a sacrifice worthy of the same recognition given to warriors who fought in open battle. She might have let the moment pass unnoticed, had it not been for an exchange she overheard shortly afterward between two of the pack's senior elders. Wolves who had served on Damon's council for decades, and who, she had always assumed, held her in the same regard as the rest of the pack seemed to. "The healer did well this siege," one of them, an older wolf named Nathan, remarked to his companion, as they stood near the fire, unaware that Elena stood close enough to hear their conversation clearly. "Though I confess, I still find it strange, after all these years, that our Alpha's most trusted advisor remains a human, bound to him by nothing more than an old debt from before any of us were born." "An old debt that has proven remarkably useful," the other elder replied, a note of dismissiveness in his tone that Elena recognized immediately, though she had rarely heard it stated so plainly before. "Whatever tie binds her to Damon, it has served the pack well enough that questioning it seems foolish. Though I do wonder sometimes whether she will simply continue this way indefinitely, an eternal resource we can draw upon whenever crisis strikes, or whether that peculiar bond of hers will eventually run its course." The words landed like a physical blow, and Elena felt something inside her go very still, a cold clarity settling over the warm haze of the evening celebration. An eternal resource we can draw upon whenever crisis strikes. It was, she realized with a sinking, painful certainty, exactly how the pack's council had always viewed her, whatever affection or gratitude individual members like Clara might genuinely feel. To the formal structure of Hollow Ridge's leadership, she had never been an equal, never a true member of the pack in the way the wolves themselves considered each other. She had been, for 261 years, a valuable and reliable tool, useful precisely because she never demanded anything in return. She stepped away from the fire before the elders noticed her presence, moving quietly toward the quieter edges of the courtyard, where the celebration's noise faded into the cool night air, and there, alone beneath the stars, she allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to fully feel the weight of what she had just overheard. It was not new information, not really. She had sensed the pattern for centuries, had felt the quiet imbalance in how her contributions were valued, compared to the warriors who fought openly in battle, the council members who advised on matters of politics and strategy. But sensing something and hearing it stated so plainly, so casually, by wolves who had known her for decades and clearly still viewed her as fundamentally separate from the pack's true membership, struck differently than the vague unease she had grown accustomed to carrying. Damon found her there a short while later, having noticed her absence from the celebration, and grown concerned when he could not locate her among the crowd still gathered near the fire. His expression shifted to worry when he saw her standing alone in the shadows, arms wrapped around herself against the cool night air. "Elena? Are you unwell? Should you not still be resting?" "I am fine," Elena said automatically, though the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. The familiar reassurance, no longer able to fully mask the raw wound the elder's conversation had opened within her. Damon studied her face carefully, clearly recognizing that something more than physical exhaustion was troubling her. "That is not true, is it?" he said gently. "Something happened during the celebration. Tell me." Elena hesitated, torn between her old instinct to shield him from unnecessary burdens and the newer, still fragile commitment they had made to greater honesty between them. Finally, she recounted the conversation she had overheard, watching Damon's expression shift from confusion to a slow, dawning anger as the full weight of the elder's words settled over him. "They should not speak of you that way," he said, his voice tight with restrained fury. "You are not a resource, Elena. You are not simply a tool this pack draws upon whenever convenient." "But that is how they see me," Elena said quietly, the words carrying 2 centuries of accumulated hurt finally surfacing in full. "Perhaps that is how this entire pack has always seen me, beneath the gratitude and the celebrations and the songs sung about crises I helped solve. I have given everything, Damon. 261 years of my life, poured entirely into serving Hollow Ridge, and I am still, to your own counsel, nothing more than an old debt that has proven useful." Damon reached for her, but she stepped back slightly, needing space to fully articulate the realization crystallizing within her, sharp and painful, and long overdue. "I do not think this is something you can simply fix by scolding your counsel for their words tonight," she continued. "This runs deeper than tonight's conversation. It runs through 2.5 centuries of my existence, being defined entirely by what I can give this pack, never by who I am beyond that usefulness." "Elena, that is not how I see you," Damon said, desperation creeping into his voice as he recognized the direction her thoughts were taking, a direction that frightened him far more than any siege ever had. "You have to know, that is not how I see you." "I want to believe that," Elena said softly, and the honesty in her voice carried a grief that had been building for far longer than this single evening's revelations. "But Damon, even you, even after everything we have built together, only fully understood how much I was suffering when I nearly died in that tunnel. It took me collapsing, nearly breaking the bond entirely, for anyone in this pack, including you, to truly see the cost of everything I have given." The accusation, however gently spoken, landed heavily between them, and Damon had no immediate response, no easy reassurance that could fully counter the painful truth in her words. They stood together in the cool darkness beyond the celebration's warm light, the victory that should have brought unity, instead exposing a fracture that had been quietly widening for far longer than either of them had allowed themselves to acknowledge. The days following the siege's end passed differently than Elena had expected. She had assumed, in the immediate aftermath of the elder's careless words, that time and distance from that single painful evening might soften the realization that had crystallized within her, might allow her to fold the hurt back into the familiar pattern of quiet endurance she had maintained for centuries. Instead, the opposite happened. The more she rested, truly rested for the first time in longer than she could remember, the more clearly she began to see the full shape of what her existence within Hollow Ridge had actually been. Henry visited her often during those quiet days of recovery, continuing his research into the old bond lore his grandmother had once taught him, searching for any knowledge that might help restore the balance between Elena and Damon before the strain reached a breaking point again. He found fragments here and there, old references and texts scattered across the pack's small library, half-remembered teachings passed down through generations of healers who had encountered similar bonds in other packs across the centuries. But nothing offered a clear, certain solution, only cautious suggestions that balance required both parties to actively choose equal exchange, a choice that could not simply be willed into existence through good intentions alone. Damon tried, in the weeks following the siege, to honor the commitment he had made to her in the healer's quarters, insisting she rest fully, delegating tasks she would normally have handled herself to other capable members of the pack, spending more deliberate time simply sitting with her, rather than immediately turning conversations toward matters of pack business. Elena appreciated the effort, recognized the genuine sincerity behind it, and yet, As the days passed, she found herself increasingly aware of how deeply the old patterns remained embedded in the pack's structure around her, patterns that Damon's individual effort, however well-intentioned, could not fully undo alone. The council continued to consult her primarily for practical matters, rarely including her in broader discussions of the pack's future, the way they included warriors and senior wolves, who held formal standing within Hollow Ridge's hierarchy. Younger pack members, raised on stories of the ancient healer who had served the pack since before living memory, treated her with a kind of distant reverence that felt, the more she examined it, uncomfortably similar to how one might regard a useful and venerable object, rather than a person with her own needs, her own desires beyond the role she had occupied for so long. She raised these observations gently with Damon, during one of their quiet evenings together, watching his expression shift through frustration, guilt, and a helpless kind of grief, as she articulated patterns that had clearly existed long before either of them had consciously examined them. I do not know how to fix 261 years of established patterns in a matter of weeks, Damon admitted one evening, his voice heavy with the particular exhaustion of someone confronting a problem far larger than any single decision could resolve. I want to, Elena. I want this pack to see you the way I see you, to value you beyond what you can provide, but I do not know how to force that shift. Not quickly, not completely. I know, Elena said quietly, and there was no accusation in her voice, only a tired, honest acknowledgement of the scale of what they were facing. I do not think this is something that can be fixed quickly, or perhaps even fixed at all, not in the way we might hope. 2.5 centuries of patterns run deep, Damon. Deeper, perhaps, than either of us fully understood until now. It was during one such quiet evening, nearly a month after the siege's end, that Elena finally allowed herself to voice the thought that had been slowly, painfully forming within her since the night of the elders' conversation, a thought she had turned over and examined from every angle, before finally accepting its weight. I think I need to leave, she said softly, the words falling into the quiet room, like stones into still water, sending ripples through the careful peace they had been building together. Damon went very still, his eyes widening with a shock that quickly transformed into something closer to panic. Leave? Elena, what are you saying? I am saying that I have spent 261 years defining my entire existence through what I could give this pack, Elena said, her voice steady, despite the emotion trembling beneath the surface of her words. I gave until I nearly died, Damon, and even then, even after everything, I am still seen by most of this pack as a resource rather than a person. I do not know how to change that from within these walls, surrounded by patterns that have existed since before most of the current pack was even born. I need to find out who I am, apart from what I can provide, before this bond finally does break, and takes everything with it. You are asking to sever the bond, Damon said, his voice rough with an emotion that sounded dangerously close to grief. Elena, do you understand what that means? After 2.5 centuries, the bond does not simply end without consequence. It could kill you, the same way letting the imbalance continue could kill you. I know the risk, Elena said, and the calm certainty in her voice, the same certainty that had guided every difficult decision she had made across her long life, settled over the room with quiet finality. But Henry believes, based on what he has learned, that a bond severed deliberately, with full understanding and consent from both parties, carries a different kind of risk than one that simply breaks from unaddressed strain. It is not without danger, but it is a choice, rather than a slow collapse I have no control over. Damon rose from where he sat, crossing the room to kneel before her chair, taking both her hands in his with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have. Please, Elena, do not do this. We can find another way. Give me more time. Give this pack more time. To truly change how you are valued here. I cannot lose you. Not after everything. Not like this. Elena felt her own eyes fill with tears, the weight of 261 years of shared history pressing against the certainty of her decision. But even through the grief, she did not waver. I am not doing this because I do not love you, Damon. I am doing this because I have spent so long being essential to your survival, to this pack's survival, that I no longer know if I am capable of existing simply as myself, valued for reasons beyond usefulness. I need to find that out. And I fear that if I stay, surrounded by patterns 2.5 centuries deep, I will never truly discover the answer. And if severing the bond kills you? Damon's voice cracked entirely on the question, all pretense of composure abandoned in the raw fear underlying it. Elena, I would rather live with an imperfect bond, with patterns we continue working to change, than risk losing you entirely. That is exactly the problem, Elena said gently, though the words carried an unmistakable finality. You are asking me to risk everything, again, for the sake of preserving something that has already nearly cost me my life. I have spent 2 centuries making that choice, Damon. Choosing the pack's survival over my own well-being. Choosing your needs over questions about my own identity. I cannot make that same choice indefinitely. Not anymore. They talked long into the night, Damon's pleading gradually giving way to a devastated, reluctant understanding, as he recognized, beneath his own fear and grief, the truth in what Elena was telling him. She was not leaving out of anger, or a failure of love, but out of a desperate need to discover whether anything of herself remained beneath 2.5 centuries of relentless, unquestioned self-sacrifice. When dawn finally broke over Hollow Ridge, Elena stood at the edge of the settlement's gate, a small pack of supplies gathered over the course of the night, resting against her shoulder, Henry standing nearby, with the careful instructions he had prepared regarding the bond's severance, a delicate process that would need to unfold slowly, deliberately, over the coming days, as she traveled beyond the reach of Damon's immediate presence. Damon stood before her, his expression carrying a grief so raw it seemed to age him, years in the span of a single sleepless night. This is truly what you need, he said, no longer a question, simply a devastated acknowledgement of a truth he could not fully accept, but would not fight any longer. It is, Elena said softly, reaching up to touch his face one final time, memorizing the familiar lines of features she had known across 2.5 centuries of shared history. I do not know what remains of me on the other side of this, Damon. I do not know if the bond's severance will change what I feel for you, or simply free me to feel it without the weight of 261 years of obligation attached. But I have to find out. I owe myself that much, after everything I have given. Damon pulled her into a final embrace, fierce and desperate, memorizing the shape of her against him, the way she was memorizing his features, both of them aware that whatever came next, this moment marked an ending neither had ever imagined facing after so many centuries of shared survival. Come back to me, he whispered against her hair, echoing words he had spoken before countless dangerous missions across their long partnership, though this time, the words carried a different, more uncertain weight. If you find whatever you are searching for, and if any part of you still wants this bond, this life, come back to me. Elena did not promise she would, unable to make guarantees about a future she genuinely could not predict. Instead, she simply held him for one final lingering moment before stepping back, shouldering her pack, and turning toward the open road beyond Hollow Ridge's gates, walking away from the only home she had known for 261 years, toward an uncertain future built, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely around the question of who she might become when no longer defined by what she could give. Behind her, Damon watched until she disappeared entirely from view, the weight of 2.5 centuries settling heavily over a pack that had, in one long and painful night, finally begun to understand exactly what they stood to lose. The months that followed Elena's departure tested Hollow Ridge in ways the siege never had. It was not a crisis of hunger or war, but a quieter, more insidious kind of struggle, the slow, uncomfortable process of a pack learning to function without the steady, invisible support that had sustained it for 261 years. Rationing systems that Elena had managed instinctively required careful new documentation for others to follow. Healing knowledge she had carried in memory alone needed to be painstakingly recorded by Henry, and the younger healers she had trained, working long hours to preserve what they could of her accumulated wisdom, before it faded entirely from living memory within the pack. Damon ruled through those difficult months with a heaviness that even his closest advisors struggled to fully understand, though Owen, who had worked alongside Elena longest and witnessed most clearly the toll her departure had taken, offered what quiet support he could during council meetings that felt, without her steady presence, somehow incomplete, despite functioning adequately on a practical level. The council itself underwent a slow, uncomfortable reckoning in the wake of Elena's absence. Nathan and the other elders who had spoken so carelessly the night of the victory celebration finding themselves confronted, repeatedly, with just how much the pack had depended on contributions they had never fully valued, while she remained present to provide them. It was not a comfortable lesson, and Damon did not shy away from making certain it was learned thoroughly, restructuring the council's formal processes to ensure that whoever eventually filled roles similar to the one Elena had occupied would never again be treated as merely a useful resource, rather than a valued member of the pack's leadership. Elena, meanwhile, traveled far from Hollow Ridge during those same months, following Henry's careful guidance regarding the delicate process of the bond's severance, a process that proved, true to Henry's warnings, both painful and dangerous. There were nights during her journey when the ache in her chest returned with an intensity that frightened her, when she wondered whether she had made a fatal miscalculation in choosing to sever a connection that had sustained her impossibly long life for so many centuries. But she survived those nights, one by one, the bond gradually loosening its hold on her, rather than snapping violently the way an unaddressed strain might have caused. She settled, eventually, in a small village, far removed from any Wolfpack's territory, a quiet human settlement where no one knew her true age, where she was simply a skilled healer who had arrived seeking a fresh start. For the first time in over 2 centuries, Elena lived a life defined entirely by her own choices, rather than the constant, urgent demands of a pack's survival. She learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, what it felt like to rest without guilt, to help others, not because her identity depended on it, but because she genuinely wanted to. A subtle but profound difference she had never fully understood, until she experienced life without the weight of centuries-old obligation shaping every decision. The physical changes came gradually, as the bond's severance completed itself over those months. Elena began, for the first time since she was a young woman, to age in ways that resembled an ordinary human lifespan, though Henry had warned her the process would likely settle into something slower than a normal human's aging, a permanent legacy of the centuries she had already lived, bound to Damon's extended life. She found she did not mind this uncertain future nearly as much as she had feared she might, discovering a quiet peace in simply existing without the constant pressure of an urgent role to fulfill. She thought of Damon often during those months, the ache of missing him a persistent companion alongside her growing sense of self-discovery, but she resisted the urge to return, understanding that whatever she was building within herself remained fragile, still forming, still requiring the space and distance she had claimed for herself. She sent no word to Hollow Ridge, though she suspected, correctly, that Henry maintained some quiet awareness of her well-being through channels she chose not to examine too closely. It was nearly a full year after her departure that Elena finally began to feel, for the first time since severing the bond, a genuine desire to reconnect with the life and the people she had left behind, not out of obligation or the old habit of self-sacrifice, but out of an authentic, freely chosen affection that had survived even the bond's complete dissolution. She thought of Damon's face on the morning she had left, the raw grief in his eyes, and wondered, with a curiosity untethered from centuries of duty, what she might find if she returned to Hollow Ridge now, as simply herself, rather than as the pack's indispensable healer. The journey back took several weeks, and Elena found herself, more than once along the way, questioning whether returning was truly the wisest choice, whether reopening a connection to a life so thoroughly defined by self-sacrifice might undo the fragile new sense of identity she had worked so hard to build. But beneath that uncertainty ran a steadier, quieter conviction, the recognition that love, freely chosen rather than woven from obligation, might be worth the risk of testing. She arrived at Hollow Ridge's gates on a cool autumn evening, the settlement looking much as she remembered it, though the walls bore new reinforcements built in the aftermath of the siege, a visible testament to the pack's continued resilience, even without her constant presence to guide their survival. Word of her arrival spread quickly through the settlement, and by the time she reached the central courtyard, a small crowd had gathered, faces she recognized shifting from surprise to cautious, hopeful welcome. Damon emerged from the main hall before she had fully crossed the courtyard, stopping several feet away, as if uncertain whether approaching further would be welcome, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of hope and fear that mirrored, she suspected, her own uncertain emotions in that moment. "Elena," he said quietly, her name carrying the weight of a full year's absence, a full year of wondering whether this moment would ever come. "I am not returning as your healer." Elena said carefully, wanting to establish clearly. From the very first exchange, the boundaries she had worked so hard to define for herself over the past year. I am not returning to resume the role I once held here, managing rations and healing wounds, and solving every crisis that threatens this pack. That version of myself, defined entirely by usefulness, is not who I am anymore, and I do not intend to return to it. Damon nodded slowly, something like relief flickering across his features despite the uncertainty still evident in his posture. I understand. I would not ask that of you again, even if you offered it. I came back, Elena continued, her voice softening slightly, because I wanted to see whether anything remains between us, that exists apart from obligation, apart from the bond that once tied us together through necessity rather than choice. I do not know what that might look like, Damon, or whether it is even possible after everything, but I wanted to find out. Damon closed the remaining distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she chose, though she did not. When he finally reached her, he did not embrace her the way he once might have, understanding instinctively that whatever connection remained between them now required rebuilding from a foundation entirely different from the one that had defined their previous 2.5 centuries together. I have missed you, he said simply, honestly, not as the pack's healer, not as the solution to every crisis we faced. I have missed you, Elena. Simply you. I do not know what that means for us now, whether love without the old bond's weight can grow into something as strong as what we shared before. But I would like the chance to find out, if you are willing. Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had carried since the morning she first walked away from these gates, finally beginning to ease. She did not know, any more than Damon did, what shape their relationship might take moving forward, whether the affection that had survived the bond's severance could grow into something sustainable, built on genuine mutual choice, rather than the desperate necessity that had first bound them together. But standing there in the cool evening air, surrounded by a pack that had learned, in her absence, to value contributions they had once taken for granted, Elena allowed herself, for the first time in over 2.5 centuries, to simply hope, without the weight of obligation attached to that hope, for a future she was choosing freely, one uncertain day at a time. I would like that too, she said softly, and as the last light of evening faded over Hollow Ridge's reinforced walls, two people who had once been bound entirely by sacrifice began, cautiously and honestly, the far more difficult work of choosing each other, simply because they wanted to, with nothing left to prove, and nothing left to owe.